I didn't notice it right away when my daughter started feeling distant to me. If you had asked me in the beginning whether anything had changed between us, I probably would have said no. I would have told you she was busy, that life moves quickly when you're young, that daughters grow up just like everyone else does. I would have smiled and said what people always say when they don't want to look too closely at something that might hurt. She's just got a lot going on. And maybe that was true. Maybe it was true for a long time. But truth can be a strange thing when it comes to family. Sometimes something can be true on the surface and still not explain the feeling underneath it. That's what I was slow to understand. Because what changed between us didn't happen all at once. There was no sharp moment. No argument I could point back to. No slammed door. No hard words that left damage behind. If anything, it was quieter than that. Softer. Almost polite. That was what made it difficult to name. Distance doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it comes in small, ordinary pieces, so small you don't recognize them until they've already built a space between you. When she was little, my daughter used to tell me everything. Not just the important things. Not even mostly the important things. She told me the small things. The things that would sound meaningless to anyone else. The kind of details only a child thinks matter and only a parent learns to treasure later. She told me which girl in her class braided her hair too tightly during recess. She told me when her teacher wore a new sweater. She told me which cereal she suddenly hated even though she'd loved it the week before. She told me which song she wanted to hear in the car and then sang over it before the first chorus even finished. She had a voice that carried through the house before she even entered a room. Mama, guess what? That was how so many afternoons began. I can still hear it. The front door opening. Her school bag hitting the floor too quickly. Shoes kicked off without much care for where they landed. Then her voice, already halfway into a story before I had even turned around. Some days I was in the kitchen when she came home. Other days I was folding laundry in the living room or wiping down the table after lunch. It didn't matter where I was. She always found me, and once she did, the whole day seemed to pour out of her in one long, bright stream. I used to think there would always be some version of that. Not exactly the same, of course. I'm not naive. Children grow. They change. Their voices deepen or soften. Their worlds expand. They become private in ways they aren't at 6 or 7 or 10. I knew all of that. But I thought the thread would stay in place. I thought she would always be someone who wanted to tell me things. Our mornings had their own rhythm back then. I still wake up early now, but it means something different than it used to. These days it's just habit. Back then it was necessity. She was never a morning person as a child. My daughter woke slowly, like someone returning from very far away. I would sit on the edge of her bed and rub her back gently while the light from the hallway spilled across her blanket. 5 more minutes, she would mumble, every morning, as though the request had never failed her before. I would laugh and tell her the same thing I always did. You said that yesterday. And it almost worked, she'd answer, eyes still closed. There are little conversations like that which don't seem important when they happen. But years later they come back to you with painful clarity. Not because they were dramatic, but because they belonged to a time when love was still built into every routine. I remember brushing her hair before school while she sat on a chair in the kitchen, still half asleep, hands wrapped around a mug of milk she wasn't drinking fast enough. I remember the way she used to lean her head against me without thinking while I tied the ribbon at the end of her braid. I remember her asking if I'd be there when she got home, as if there had ever been any chance I wouldn't. And I always was. I built so much of my life around being there. That's what motherhood felt like to me for many years. Not just loving your child, but arranging yourself around their needs so naturally that you no longer think of it as sacrifice. It's just the shape your life takes. Afternoons were homework at the kitchen table. Evenings were dinner, baths, stories, the slow unwinding of the house. There were dance classes for a few years, then piano lessons she didn't really love but completed anyway because once she started something, she hated to disappoint anyone. There were birthday parties, school projects, parent meetings, forgotten permission slips, and last-minute costume requests the night before some event she had definitely known about for weeks but only remembered when I was already tired. And through all of it she talked. That was always the center of it. She talked while I chopped vegetables. She talked while I folded towels. She talked from the bathroom doorway while brushing her teeth. She talked from the back seat of the car about girls I had never met, and worries that seemed small until I saw how large they were in her face. When she became a teenager, I expected a little distance. Everyone told me to. Teenage girls pull away from their mothers for a while. It's normal. Don't take it personally. And maybe that was wise advice. Maybe some of it was even comforting at the time. But advice has a way of flattening things that feel much more personal when you're inside them. Because yes, she became more private. Of course she did. She spent more time in her room. She closed her door more often. She started answering certain questions with, fine, or nothing, or I'm just tired, in that tone that tells you the conversation is over even before it has properly begun. But even then, even in those years, I never felt shut out. There were still late-night moments when she would come downstairs after everyone else had gone to bed and stand in the kitchen in her socks, opening and closing the refrigerator without really wanting anything, just because she needed someone to talk to and didn't know how to begin. There were still car rides when she would start telling me something halfway through a drive because looking straight ahead made it easier than looking directly at me. There were still weekends when she would sit on the end of my bed while I sorted laundry and ask questions that weren't really questions. Questions about friendships. About boys. About whether I had ever felt left out, unsure, embarrassed, invisible. I learned that motherhood changes, but sometimes it doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. Less obvious. More dependent on patience. And I was patient. At least I thought I was. When she left home, I told myself we had built the kind of relationship that would hold. Not because I expected constant closeness. Not because I believed adulthood would leave everything untouched. But because we had history. Because we had spent years learning each other's ways. Because some people, you assume, will always know how to return to you. In the beginning, she called often. Not every day, but enough. A question about a recipe. A quick complaint about work. A story about someone she'd met. A message just to say she'd had a long day and wanted to hear a familiar voice. I never demanded those calls. I didn't need to. They came naturally. Sometimes I would be standing in the grocery store comparing prices on fruit I didn't even really need, and my phone would ring, and there she'd be, talking while walking somewhere, asking if I remembered the name of a teacher she'd had in 9th grade, or telling me about a dress she almost bought and then didn't. Those were ordinary conversations. And like so many ordinary things, I didn't understand their value until they changed. It happened slowly. At first, the shifts were so small I explained them away before they could settle in. She was busy. Work was demanding. Life was expensive. People are tired. Young women especially carry so much now. Their jobs, their relationships, their plans, their phones always buzzing with too much information and not enough meaning. I told myself all of that, and I wasn't wrong. But I also wasn't entirely right. The calls became shorter first. Then less frequent. Then a little more distracted. I would hear something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not coldness. Not irritation. Just a kind of distance. As though her attention was divided between me and 5 other invisible things happening around her. I would ask how she was, and she would say, "Busy," with a laugh that was meant to make it sound light. I would ask what she'd done over the weekend, and she would give me the outline instead of the story. I started hearing about things after they had already happened. A dinner with friends. A trip she'd taken. A decision about work. Not because she was hiding anything. That almost made it harder. It just didn't seem to occur to her to tell me anymore. That was new. I remember one evening in particular, though at the time I didn't know why it stayed with me. I was in the kitchen making soup. A simple one, with carrots and celery and noodles. One of those meals I still make out of habit when the weather turns cool, the kind that once fed a whole household and now leaves too much in the pot. The house was quiet except for the sound of the spoon against the side of the pan. My phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen, and I smiled without thinking. That instinct was still there then. That lift in the chest. I answered too quickly, as mothers often do. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, Mom," she said, and for a second it sounded almost like always. She asked me a practical question. Something small about paperwork, I think. Or maybe insurance. One of those adult details children eventually bring to their parents not because they need comfort, but because parents still carry the old role of knowing how to handle things. I answered as best I could. She thanked me. There was a brief pause. Then I waited for the rest of the conversation to begin. For the personal part. The natural part. The part where she would tell me something she didn't need to tell me, just because she wanted to. But it didn't come. Instead, she said, "Okay, I should go. I just needed to ask you that." I remember standing there with the spoon in my hand. Steam rising from the pot. The kitchen light too bright for the time of day. And I said, "Of course." She told me she'd talk to me soon. Then she was gone. It was such a small thing. So small that I almost felt embarrassed by how long I stood there afterward. Not hurt exactly. Just aware. Aware that something had shifted in a way I couldn't yet name. I turned back to the stove and kept stirring the soup, but I wasn't really thinking about dinner anymore. I was thinking about how strange it felt to realize that a conversation could still be kind, still familiar, and yet leave behind a silence it hadn't left before. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more little things. I was usually the one who called first. When she answered, she sounded glad to hear from me. Truly glad. I believe that. But sometimes she also sounded slightly rushed, as if she had made space for me rather than naturally fallen into it. Messages replaced calls more often. And messages are strange things. Efficient. Harmless. Easy to read too much into. Easy to mistake for connection when what you really miss is a voice. I'd send, "How are you?" She'd reply, "Good. Just busy." A heart at the end. A small softening. Enough to reassure me and somehow not enough at all. One Sunday afternoon I found myself setting 2 cups on the kitchen counter before catching myself. I don't know why I did it. She wasn't coming over. There had been no plan. Maybe the weather reminded me of older Sundays when she'd stop by after doing errands, still carrying that feeling of having belonged to this house even after moving out. Maybe I was just tired and my hands remembered something before my mind did. I stood there looking at the second cup for a moment, then quietly put it back in the cupboard. That was when I started to understand that what I missed wasn't only her presence. It was the old ease between us. The unplanned nearness. The feeling that I still lived somewhere natural inside her day. And once that thought entered me, it did not leave. A few days later, I called her in the evening. She answered on the 4th ring. She sounded warm, but tired. We talked for a little while. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was tense. She asked how I'd been. I asked about work. She told me she'd been thinking about repainting her apartment. I told her she always changed rooms when something in her life felt unsettled, and she laughed, because she knew that was true. For a moment, it felt easy again. Then, somewhere in the middle of a sentence, I heard another voice in the background. Someone saying her name. Her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Not colder. Just turned elsewhere. "Oh, hold on," she said. "I'm actually with someone." There was nothing wrong with that, of course. Nothing at all. Still, something inside me became very still. "Of course," I said. "We can talk later," she answered quickly. But later, I noticed, was becoming one of those words that meant less and less each time it was used. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the living room without turning on the lamp. The evening light had almost disappeared, and the room was beginning to lose its edges. I thought about her as a little girl, padding into the kitchen in pajamas, unable to keep a thought to herself for more than 30 seconds. And I thought about the woman she had become, standing in some other room, in some other life, with someone calling her name while I sat in mine. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter than both. A kind of realization I wasn't quite ready to fully hold. That maybe the distance I kept explaining away as busyness was beginning to be something else. For a long time after that evening, I told myself not to think too much about what I had noticed. It's easy to do that when you're a parent. You learn early that your feelings are not always the most important thing in the room. Children have needs. Then teenagers have needs. Then young adults have needs. And somewhere along the way, you become used to stepping slightly to the side of your own expectations so their lives can move forward more easily. That habit stays with you longer than you expect. So when I began noticing the distance between my daughter and me, I explained it to myself the same way I had explained everything else over the years. She's busy. She's building something. This is normal. And it was normal. At least part of it was. Still, there are small moments that don't feel normal even when you try to convince yourself they are. I remember one Saturday morning not long after that phone call. The house was quiet in the way it has been for years now. Not an empty kind of quiet. Just the ordinary quiet of a house that has finished its loudest seasons. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window the way I often do, watching people walk their dogs along the sidewalk across the street. There used to be a time when Saturdays meant something different. She would come downstairs later than she should have, still half asleep, hair loose across her face, asking what we were doing that day before she had even fully woken up. Sometimes she would sit at the kitchen table in her socks and drink coffee with me long before she was old enough to like the taste of it. She always said she liked the idea of coffee before she liked the coffee itself. "I think it makes me feel grown up," she once told me. "You already are," I said. "No," she answered. "Not yet." That memory came back to me very clearly that morning. I could almost see her sitting in the chair across from me again. Almost. Instead, the chair was empty. Not in a painful way. Just in a noticeable way. Later that afternoon, I decided to call her. Not because anything was wrong. Just because I had been thinking about her all morning. She didn't answer right away. That wasn't unusual. She called back about 20 minutes later. "I saw your call," she said. "I was out." "That's all right," I told her. "I was just checking in." We talked for a few minutes. About the weather. About something she was planning for work. About a friend of hers I had met once years earlier and barely remembered now. The conversation was easy. Comfortable. Still familiar. But it ended sooner than I expected it to. "I have to go meet someone," she said. "Of course," I answered. She said she'd call me later that week. Later. That word again. It stayed with me after the call ended. Not because I didn't believe her. Because I had begun noticing how often later meant something different now than it used to. That evening I made dinner for myself. It was one of the recipes she used to ask for when she lived at home. Pasta with vegetables and a sauce she always said tasted better the second day than the first. I don't even know why I chose that meal. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was just something familiar on a day when familiar things felt comforting. While the pasta boiled, I found myself reaching for my phone without thinking. Not because it rang. Because I thought it might. That surprised me. I stood there for a moment holding the phone in my hand before setting it back down again. I didn't want to become someone who waited. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated than that. A few days later, I was sorting through a drawer in the hallway that I hadn't opened in a long time. Inside were small things I had saved without thinking much about why. School notes. Birthday cards. A bracelet she had made one summer out of thread that faded almost immediately, but which I had never thrown away. At the bottom of the drawer was a folded piece of paper I recognized right away. It was a note she had written when she was about 9 years old. Her handwriting was uneven then. Large letters where there should have been small ones. Words pressed too hard into the paper. "Don't forget I love you even when I'm mad," it said. I sat down on the edge of the hallway bench without meaning to. Held that note in my hands longer than I expected. There is something about seeing your child's handwriting from years earlier that brings back a version of them you don't see anymore. Not because they are gone. Because they have changed. And you have too. I put the note back carefully and closed the drawer. For the rest of that afternoon I moved through the house more slowly than usual. Not sad. Just thoughtful. Later that week she called me unexpectedly. Her name appeared on my phone in the middle of the afternoon, while I was folding laundry. For a second I felt that same quick lift in my chest that I used to feel years ago. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi," she said. Her voice sounded different that day. Not distant. Not rushed. Just tired in a way I hadn't heard before. We talked longer than we had in a while. About work. About a trip she might take. About whether she should move to a different apartment closer to her office. She asked my opinion the way she used to. Really asked it. Not politely. Honestly. For a little while, it felt like the old rhythm had returned. Then she said something that changed the feeling of the conversation in a way I didn't fully understand until later. "I don't always tell you everything anymore," she said suddenly. The sentence surprised me. Not because it was unkind. Because it was honest. "I know," I answered. "I just don't want you to worry," she added quickly. I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "I've always worried," I told her. "That's part of the job." She laughed softly. "I know." There was a pause after that. The kind of pause that used to lead into another story when she was younger. But this time it didn't. Instead, she changed the subject. Asked me something about the garden. About whether the tomatoes had started growing yet. We talked for a few more minutes. Then the call ended the same way most of our recent calls had ended. Warmly. Kindly. Briefly. Afterward, I sat at the kitchen table longer than I meant to. Thinking about what she had said. "I don't always tell you everything anymore." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a confession. It was simply the truth. And something about hearing her say it out loud made the distance between us feel more real than it had before. Not larger. Just clearer. That evening I walked past her old room without stopping. Then I turned back and opened the door anyway. The room still looked the way it had for years. Books on the shelf. A scarf draped over the chair she had forgotten the last winter she lived at home. A small framed photo on the desk from a school trip I barely remembered but which she had loved at the time. I stood there looking at the room for a long time. Trying to understand something I hadn't wanted to name yet. It wasn't that she didn't love me. I knew she did. It wasn't that she didn't care. She did. It was something else. Something quieter than either of those things. The place I used to hold in her daily life had changed. And I was only beginning to understand what that meant. That realization stayed with me for several days after I stood in her room that evening. Not like a weight. More like a question I kept turning over quietly in my mind. The place I used to hold in her daily life had changed. I repeated that sentence to myself more than once, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was still learning what it meant to live with it. For many years, my daughter's life had moved around me without either of us noticing that it was happening. Her school schedules shaped my mornings. Her activities shaped my evenings. Her friendships shaped our weekends. Even her moods shaped the atmosphere of the house in ways that felt natural at the time, and only became visible later. I had never asked for that closeness. It simply existed. And because it existed for so long, I thought some part of it always would. One afternoon not long after that, I was walking through the grocery store when I saw something that made me stop without meaning to. It was a small thing. A young woman standing near the cereal aisle with her mother. They weren't doing anything unusual. Just talking. The daughter held a box in her hands and turned it over slowly while her mother said something I couldn't hear. Then the daughter laughed. Not politely. Not carefully. Freely. And without thinking about it, she leaned her shoulder against her mother's arm while she laughed. That small gesture stayed with me long after I left the store. Not because I was sad. Because I recognized it. My daughter used to do that. She used to lean against me like that when she was deciding something small. What cereal to choose. Which notebook she liked better. Whether she wanted to go somewhere or stay home. Those gestures disappear slowly. You don't notice them when they stop happening. You only remember them when you see them somewhere else. Later that same week, she came over for dinner. Not for a special reason. Just because she happened to be nearby. She called earlier that afternoon and said she might stop by if she finished what she was working on. Only if it's not too late, she added. It's never too late, I told her. And I meant that. I cooked more than I needed to, the way I always do when she comes over. Some habits never change. While I was setting the table, I noticed myself moving a second chair slightly closer without thinking. The same way I used to years earlier when she was small and preferred sitting near me instead of across from me. She arrived just after the light outside began to fade. The sound of her key in the door still felt familiar in a way I hadn't expected. She walked into the kitchen and put her bag on the chair the way she always has. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed at all. We talked easily while I finished cooking. About work. About something she was planning to fix in her apartment. About a neighbor she wasn't sure she liked yet. The conversation moved the way it always had. Naturally. Comfortably. And then, somewhere in the middle of dinner, I noticed something I hadn't been ready to see before. She checked her phone more than once while we were talking. Not in a rude way. Not in a distracted way. Just in the ordinary way people do now without thinking about it. Still, I noticed. Years earlier, when she sat at this same table, there had been nothing else competing for her attention. This had been the center of her evening. Now it was only one part of it. We finished dinner and moved into the living room with tea the way we used to on Sundays when she still lived at home. For a while, we talked about small things. Then there was a pause. Not an uncomfortable pause. Just a quiet one. I don't come by as often as I used to, she said suddenly. The sentence surprised me. Not because it wasn't true. Because she had said it before I had. No, I answered gently. You don't. She looked down at her hands for a moment. I think about coming more, she said. I know, I told her. And I did. Things get busy, she added. I nodded. I remember being busy, I said. She smiled a little at that. Then she said something else that stayed with me long after she left that evening. I always assume you know I'm still close to you, she said. It was such a simple sentence. And such an important one. I do know that, I answered. But I also understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully understood before. Closeness doesn't always look the same as it used to. When she was young, closeness meant stories told across the kitchen table before homework was finished. It meant long car rides filled with questions she didn't yet know how to answer. It meant late-night conversations that started with nothing and somehow became everything. Now closeness meant something quieter. Something less visible. Something that didn't always arrive in the form of visits, or long phone calls or shared routines. After she left that evening, I stood in the kitchen for a while before clearing the table. The house was quiet again. But it didn't feel empty. It felt settled. I washed the dishes slowly. Put the cups back where they belong. Turned off the light above the stove the way I always do before going into the living room. And as I did those ordinary things, I found myself thinking about something I hadn't considered clearly before. Distance isn't always something that happens between people. Sometimes it's something that happens inside time itself. Children don't stop being close to us. They simply stop needing us in the same way. And that change can feel larger than it really is if we don't take time to understand it. A few days later, she called me while I was sitting by the window in the afternoon. Not for anything important. just to tell me about something small that had happened at work. The call didn't last long. 10 minutes, maybe? But when it ended, I didn't find myself wishing it had lasted longer. I found myself feeling grateful that it had happened at all. That surprised me. Not because gratitude was new, because the expectation had changed. For years, I had expected to be part of the center of her days. Now I understood that I was part of their edges. Still there. Still present. Just differently. One evening not long after that, I passed her old room again. This time I didn't stop in the doorway. I didn't need to. The memories inside it were no longer something I felt I had to visit in order to understand where we stood now. They were already part of me. And so was she. Later that week, she sent me a message about something she was cooking. A recipe she couldn't quite remember. A small question that didn't really need answering. I told her what I could remember. She thanked me with a small heart at the end of the message. And for the first time in a long time, I understood something clearly. My daughter hadn't become distant from me. She had simply stepped further into her own life. And somehow, without noticing exactly when it happened, I had begun stepping into mine too.